The stagecoach had been running 3 hours behind schedule by the time it finally rolled down the main street of Red Hollow, and the driver was in no mood to make apologies about it. He pulled the horses up hard in front of the cattleman's hotel, set the brake with a grunt, and climbed down from the box without a word to any of his passengers. He had freight to unload and a dry throat that needed tending to, and neither of those things was going to wait on the personal business of whoever happened to be riding inside. Clara Whitmore felt the coach lurch to a stop and pressed her hands flat against her thighs to keep them from shaking. 3 days. That was all she had managed. 3 days of marriage to Victor Kane, and already she understood with a cold certainty that settled somewhere behind her sternum that she had made a catastrophic mistake. She had known it on the first night, when the man who had courted her with careful letters and pressed flowers had looked at her across the dinner table in the hotel in Abilene and told her, in a voice as flat as prairie grass, that she would not be permitted to speak unless spoken to. She had thought foolishly that it was nerves, that the long journey and the unfamiliar surroundings had made him strange. She had told herself that people were complicated, and that she did not yet know him well enough to judge. She had stopped telling herself those things on the second night. And now, on the third day, as the stagecoach door swung open and Victor Kane stepped out into the thin autumn light of Red Hollow, Clara sat very still inside and tried to calculate how much money she had left in the small cloth purse she kept tucked inside her boot. $11.40. She had counted it twice that morning while Victor slept, her fingers moving over the coins with the careful attention of a woman who understood, perhaps too late, that $11.40 was the difference between having options and having none. Get out. Victor said it without looking back at her. He was already standing on the street, brushing dust from the shoulders of his coat with the methodical irritation of a man who found the entire world slightly beneath him. Clara gathered her skirts and moved toward the door. She was careful about it, deliberately careful, the way she had learned to be careful about everything over the past 72 hours. But the step down from the coach was higher than she expected, or her legs were more unsteady than she had realized, and her boot caught the edge of the iron step and she stumbled. She did not fall all the way down. She caught herself on the doorframe, her palms scraping against the painted wood, and she managed to get one foot on the ground before the other one followed, ungracefully, into the reddish dust of Red Hollow's main street. What happened next occurred so quickly that the people closest to the coach, a woman in a gray bonnet, 2 men talking in front of the feed store, a boy leading a mule toward the livery, would later describe it with the slightly dazed quality of people who had witnessed something they hadn't quite been prepared for. Victor Kane's hand shot out and closed around Clara's upper arm before she had fully regained her footing. He didn't say anything. His face didn't change. He simply pivoted with the same calm, deliberate motion he might have used to discard a newspaper he had finished reading, and threw her. It wasn't a complicated action. He had enough strength in his arm and enough momentum from her stumble that it required very little effort on his part. Clara went sideways, her skirts twisting around her legs, and she hit the ground hard, shoulder first, then hip, her cheek catching the edge of a wagon rut that had dried into something close to stone. The sound was not dramatic. It was just the soft, ugly thud of a human body meeting packed earth. For a moment, nobody moved. Victor straightened his coat, looked down at her with an expression that was not anger and was not contempt, but was somehow worse than either. It was the look of a man evaluating a piece of property that had disappointed him. And then he picked up his traveling bag from where the driver had set it on the boardwalk and walked toward the hotel without a backward glance. Clara lay in the dirt. Her cheek stung where it had hit the ground. Her shoulder would bruise by evening. She already knew that, could feel the deep pulse of it beginning. The dust was in her mouth and in her nose and on the front of her dress. The blue wool dress she had worn because it was her nicest traveling dress, and she had wanted, on the day she arrived in her new home, to look like a woman who belonged somewhere. She was aware, distantly, of the people watching her. The woman in the gray bonnet had stopped walking. The 2 men in front of the feed store had gone quiet. The boy with the mule had turned to look. A few people had drifted to the edge of the boardwalk, drawn by the sound or by some instinct that told them something worth watching had happened. Nobody came toward her. Clara put her hand flat in the dirt and pushed herself up to sitting. Her palm was bleeding slightly where it had scraped against the wagon rut. She looked at it for a moment, then looked up at the people watching her. "Ma'am?" It was the boy with the mule who spoke, uncertainly, as though he wasn't sure he had the right to. He was perhaps 14, with a face full of freckles and an expression that suggested he understood this was bad, but had no idea what he was supposed to do about it. "I'm fine," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She got to her feet without help. It took 2 attempts, and it was not graceful, and she was aware of every pair of eyes on her as she did it, but she managed it, and she stood up in the middle of Red Hollow's main street with blood on her palm and dust on her dress, and her hair coming loose from its pins. And she looked at the door of the Cattleman's Hotel, where Victor Kane had disappeared. The woman in the gray bonnet said something to the man beside her. Clara didn't hear the words, but she heard the tone. The particular tone of someone arriving at a conclusion they found satisfying. The tone that said, "Well, there's always a reason for these things." Clara picked up the small traveling bag that had fallen from her hand when she hit the ground, checked that the strap hadn't broken, and walked to the side of the street, out of the way of horses and wagons. She sat down on the edge of the boardwalk in front of what appeared to be a dry goods store and tried to think. She was in Red Hollow, Texas. She had $11.40. She knew no one in this town. Her husband, she still had to call him that, she had no other word for him, was 30 feet away in a hotel. She had no family to wire for help. Her mother had been dead for 6 years, and her father had remarried and made it clear, with a kindness that was somehow worse than cruelty, that his new family did not have room for a grown daughter who had not yet managed to become someone else's responsibility. She had come to Red Hollow because Victor Kane had answered the advertisement she had placed in the Frontier Gazette 6 months ago. He had written her 12 letters, 12 careful, measured letters about his ranch and his plans and the life he intended to build. He had described himself as a man of discipline and ambition. He had not been lying about that. He had simply neglected to describe what his discipline looked like when it was turned on someone who had made herself dependent on him. The door of the dry goods store opened behind her, and a woman stepped out with a broom and began sweeping the boardwalk. She was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had once been pleasant and had been weathered into something watchful and closed. She swept around Clara without looking at her directly. "You'll want to move along," the woman said to the broom, apparently. "Sheriff doesn't like people sitting on storefronts." "I'm not causing any trouble," Clara said. "Didn't say you were." The woman swept a small pile of dust off the edge of the boardwalk. "Just saying." Clara stood up and moved along the boardwalk because she didn't have the energy or the standing to argue. She walked slowly, not because she had anywhere to go, but because walking was something to do. And she thought better when her body was moving. The town of Red Hollow was not large. A main street with perhaps 20 businesses on either side, a side street or 2 branching off it, a church at one end, and at the other the stockyards with their particular smell that carried on even a light wind. The buildings were mostly wood, mostly weathered, with a few newer ones in between that had the look of ambition that had not yet been beaten down by reality. She passed a barber shop, a lawyer's office. She slowed at that one, looking at the painted letters on the glass, but didn't go in. A saloon with its doors propped open and the sound of a piano coming from somewhere in its depths, even at this hour. A blacksmith shop, a doctor's office. She stopped at the doctor's office. Her cheek was still stinging, and her shoulder had moved from a pulse to a steady ache, and her palm needed cleaning before it had a chance to fester. She had $11.40, and she needed to spend it carefully, but she also needed her hand to work because hands were how a person earned a living, and $11.40 would not last long enough for that fact to become irrelevant. She pushed open the door. The doctor was a young man, younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he was not sleeping enough, and a manner that suggested he was aware of it. He was writing at his desk when she came in, and he looked up with the automatic alert expression of someone who has learned to be ready for whatever comes through the door. His eyes went to her face, her palm, the state of her dress. "Sit down," he said, setting aside his pen. His name was Dr. Aldous Webb. He cleaned her palm without a lot of unnecessary talk about how she had come to be in this condition, which Clara appreciated more than she would have known how to say. He put 2 small stitches in the deepest part of the scrape, charged her 50 cents, and told her to keep it clean. "The bruising on your face will be worse tomorrow," he said, which was the most direct thing anyone in this town had said to her yet. "I know," Clara said. He looked at her for a moment. "Is there somewhere you're staying?" "Not yet." He picked up his pen again. "Mrs. Halverson runs a boarding house on the 2nd street over. She's reasonable, and she doesn't ask a lot of questions." He said it carefully, looking at his paper, as though he was simply passing along useful information and not, in fact, doing her a kindness. "Thank you," Clara said. She went back out into the street. Mrs. Halverson's boarding house cost $2 a week, which meant Clara had roughly 5.5 weeks before she was out of options. The room was small and clean and looked out on a back alley where a large orange cat sat in the sun and watched her with profound indifference. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands for a long time. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the past 3 days, mostly in the early hours of the morning when Victor slept and she lay beside him in the dark, feeling the particular loneliness of being in the wrong place with the wrong person. She was done with crying. Crying had not gotten her anywhere useful. What she needed was a job. She went back out within the hour and spent the afternoon walking the length of the main street, asking. The dry goods store didn't need help. The barber laughed. The woman who ran the millinery shop looked at Clara's bruised cheek and the bandage on her hand and said she didn't think it would be a good fit. Clara didn't know exactly what she meant by that, whether she was concerned about appearances or whether she had drawn her own conclusions about what a woman who looked like Clara looked like, and she didn't ask. She sat down that evening in the small dining room of Mrs. Halverson's boarding house and ate a bowl of beef stew and a piece of cornbread and listened to the 2 other boarders. Men, both of them, a traveling salesman and a surveyor, talk about the weather without addressing a single word to her. "You just get in today?" Mrs. Halverson asked, setting a cup of coffee in front of her. "Yes." Mrs. Halverson was a woman who had clearly decided that looking at things directly was the most efficient approach to life. She looked at Clara's face, at the bandage, at the particular set of her shoulders, and then she said, "Victor Kane's wife?" Clara's stomach tightened. "Yes." "He's been in town before," Mrs. Halverson said, not passing judgment, just placing him in the landscape of the town. "I see," Clara said. Mrs. Halverson took the empty stew bowl away and brought more coffee without being asked. It wasn't sympathy exactly. It was something more practical than sympathy. Clara took the coffee and drank it and went upstairs and lay down on the clean bed in the small room and looked at the ceiling and tried to think about what came next. She spent 2 more days in Red Hollow trying to find work and not finding it. She was not entirely sure why. She was capable. She had worked her father's household from the time she was 12, had managed accounts and correspondence, and the running of a small farm. She could cook and sew and keep records. And she had told all of this to everyone she spoke to. The problem, as far as she could tell, was not her competence. The problem was something more ambient, a quality that the town seemed to have settled on about her, a story it had told itself, in which she was a certain kind of woman in a certain kind of situation, and the situation was probably, in some way, her own doing. She saw Victor twice on the street. The first time she crossed to the other side before he could see her. The second time she wasn't fast enough. He was coming out of the bank. He was wearing his good coat, and he looked completely ordinary. The kind of man you would trust to hold your horse or witness your signature on a document. He saw her, and for a moment his face registered nothing at all. And then something shifted in it, something cold and calculating that she had learned to read over the course of 3 days, and he said, "Clara." "Victor," she said. "You look terrible," he said. He said it pleasantly. "That seems appropriate," she said, and kept walking. She heard him start to say something else, her name again, or something close to it. And then she turned the corner and put a building between herself and him, and she stood against the wall for a long moment, with her heart hitting hard against her ribs before she started walking again. She had been in Red Hollow for 3 days, which meant she was already 2 weeks into her 5.5 weeks of money. She was no closer to employment. Victor Kane was staying in the town's best hotel, and had been seen in the bank and in the land office and in the law offices of a man named Dade Ferris, who, according to Mrs. Halverson, handled most of the significant property transactions in the territory. Whatever Victor was doing in Red Hollow, he was not planning to leave quickly. She needed a different plan. It was on the 4th morning that Caleb Mercer found her. That wasn't quite how she would have described it later. She was not lost. She was sitting on the bench outside the post office, reading a notice board that included among its items a call for a schoolteacher's aide, which she was trying to determine if she was qualified for. Caleb Mercer came out of the post office with a parcel under his arm and nearly walked into her and then stopped and looked at the notice board and then at her and said, "You thinking about that position?" He was tall, which was the first thing she noticed, and unhurried, which was the second. He had the look of a man who spent most of his time outdoors, lean and weathered, with hands that were calloused in the specific way that ranch work made them, and a quality of attention about him that was not intrusive but was very thorough. He was perhaps 35. "I'm thinking about whether I'm qualified," she said. "What's your background?" She looked at him. In her experience, men who asked direct questions of women they didn't know were either very direct or very forward, and she had not yet determined which category he fell into. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "The school teacher is my cousin's wife. Position opened up 2 weeks ago. I picked up her mail today because she's still trying to sort through the applications she's already received." He held up the parcel slightly. "If you're not what she's looking for, I could just tell you now and save you the trouble of writing a letter." Clara looked at him for a moment. "I ran my father's household in correspondence from the time I was 12. I can teach basic arithmetic, reading, and letter writing. I don't have formal certification." "She's not looking for certification," he said. "She's looking for someone reliable." He seemed to weigh something for a moment. "You're Mrs. Kane." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise in a town this size. Something moved across his face. Not pity, which she would have resented, and not judgment, which she had received plenty of. Something more like acknowledgement, like he had been given a piece of information and was simply placing it where it fit. "The position is mornings only," he said. $6 a month. He looked at the notice board, then back at her. "I'll tell her you're interested if you want. Decision's hers." "Yes," Clara said. "Please tell her." He nodded. He shifted the parcel to his other arm and started to move away. And then he stopped and turned back slightly and said, "There's also a woman on my ranch who does laundry 3 days a week. She's been looking for someone to help her with the heavier work. It's not much, maybe $1.50 a week on top of the teaching, if you get it. But it's something." Clara looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" He seemed to consider the question as if it was a fair one. "Because you're sitting on that bench looking at that notice board, and you've got a bruise on your face that's about 3 days old, and I've been in this town twice in the last week, and both times I saw Victor Kane, and both times he looked like a man with a lot of plans and no conscience about any of them." He shifted the parcel again. "None of that's my business, but you being able to feed yourself is." She didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't sure she had the vocabulary for it, for a person offering something without wanting anything back, without the particular weight of obligation that usually came with help. "I appreciate that," she said finally. He nodded again, as the way of a man who didn't require more than that, and said he'd get word to her through Mrs. Halverson about the teaching position, and then he walked away down the street with his parcel and his unhurried stride and his calloused hands, and Clara sat on the bench and looked at the notice board for another few minutes before she realized she was not reading it anymore. The teaching position fell through. The schoolteacher's wife, a woman named Mrs. Pierce, who was perfectly kind about it, had already promised the job to someone else by the time Caleb Mercer delivered Clara's name, and she sent along her apologies in a note that Clara received the following morning. What arrived with the note, in the same envelope, was the address of the woman on Caleb Mercer's ranch who needed help with laundry. Clara went. The ranch was 4 miles outside of town, down a road that was partly dirt and partly rock and entirely unpleasant to walk in second-hand boots. And by the time she arrived, the woman who did the laundry, a compact, gray-haired Mexican woman named Dolores, who had apparently been on the Mercer ranch for 15 years, had already formed an opinion of her. "He said you were stubborn," Dolores said, looking at Clara's boots and then at the road and then at Clara again. "He said that?" "Not exactly." Dolores turned back toward the large wash shed. "Come inside, there's coffee." Dolores was not warm, exactly, because warmth was not the right word for her. But she was straightforward and she was fair, and within half an hour she had showed Clara what the work was, and assessed that Clara could do it, and offered her $1.75 a week, with the option to take her noon meal at the ranch if she didn't mind eating plain food and plain conversation. Clara said she didn't mind. Caleb Mercer himself appeared briefly that afternoon, checking on something in the barn adjacent to the wash shed. He nodded at Clara through the door when he saw her, the way a person acknowledges someone they expected to find in a certain place, and then he went about his business. She walked back to town that evening with sore arms and her first wages, an advance of 50 cents that Dolores had pressed into her hand with the efficiency of a woman who understood that people had practical needs. And she felt something that was not quite hope, but was close enough to it to be worth noting. She had been at the Mercer Ranch for 6 days when Victor found her. She didn't know how he knew where she was working. Red Hollow was not a large town, and people talked. It didn't matter. He came to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon when Caleb was out riding the eastern fence line, and Dolores had gone to the main house to return a basket. Clara was in the wash shed, finishing the last of a load of shirts, when she heard the horse in the yard and looked up through the door and saw Victor Kane dismounting with the easy confidence of a man who had never, in his adult life, arrived anywhere he wasn't sure of his welcome. She stayed where she was. He came to the door of the shed and stood there for a moment, looking at her with his head slightly to one side, as though he was evaluating something. "You look like a laundress," he said. "I am a laundress," Clara said. She kept her hands moving, wringing water from a shirt over the tub. "That's unfortunate." He stepped inside without being invited. The shed was not large, and his presence in it made it considerably smaller. "I've had a conversation with Dade Ferris about our situation. He says the law is fairly clear about a wife's obligations to her husband." "What obligations did he specify?" "Residence," Victor said. "Companionship. The duties that belong to a wife." Clara set the shirt down and looked at him. She had been thinking, in the 6 days since she had started working at the Mercer Ranch, about what she was going to do when this moment came. She had known it was going to come. Victor Kane was not the kind of man who lost something without coming to collect it. "I don't intend to come back to you," she said. He looked at her with that expression again, the evaluating one, the one that treated her as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be spoken to. "That's not actually your decision to make," he said. "I think it is." Dade Ferris disagrees. "Then perhaps," Clara said, "I should speak with a different lawyer." Something shifted in Victor's face. Not anger. Anger was too reactive, too human for Victor Kane. It was more like a recalibration, the look of a man adjusting his strategy. "You have nothing," he said. "You have no money, no standing, no family, and no legal ground to stand on. Whatever you think you're building here," he gestured at the wash shed, at the tubs and the clotheslines and the work she had been doing, "it's not enough. It won't be enough." "That might be true," Clara said. "It is true." "Then you won't mind waiting for me to find that out for myself." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat, which he had removed when he came inside, a courtesy so automatic it was almost insulting, and put it back on his head. "I'll be in contact," he said, and walked back to his horse. Clara stood in the wash shed after he left and listened to the sound of his horse's hooves on the dry ground until they faded. Her hands were shaking, she noticed. She held them flat against the side of the tub until they stopped. She was still standing there when Caleb Mercer came around the corner of the barn. He looked at her. He looked at the yard where the fresh tracks of a horse were still visible in the dust. He looked back at her. "Victor Kane," she said, before he could ask. He nodded slowly. "He says I'm legally obligated to return to him," she said. He cited the law. "There's a lawyer in Alton, that's a 2-hour ride east, who isn't in Dade Ferris's pocket," Caleb said. "His name is Emmett Hollis. He's old and he's not easy to talk to, but he's thorough and he's honest." Clara looked at him. "You're telling me this now, after Victor Kane just came to your property." "I was thinking about it anyway," he said. She studied him for a moment, the unhurried quality of him, the way he said things directly without making them into more than they were. "Why?" she said. He looked at her, then looked away toward the fence line, then back. "Because you've worked 6 days without complaint, and you've done the work well, and you haven't asked anyone for anything you didn't earn, and because I've known Victor Kane by reputation for 2 years, and I know what kind of man he is, and because—" He stopped, seemed to edit something out. "Because it's the right thing," he said. "That's a practical answer," Clara said. "It's an honest one." She thought about that for a moment. She thought about the $11 she had arrived with, and the boarding house room, and the school teacher's position that hadn't come through, and the long walk and the bad boots. She thought about the bench outside the post office, and this man walking out of it and not walking past her. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Hollis," she said. I'll need to know if I can afford him. He works on a sliding scale, Caleb said, and he doesn't start the meter until he's heard the case and decided he can help. Clara nodded. She turned back to the tub and picked up the shirt she had set down when Victor arrived. Thank you, she said. You already said that, he said. You don't have to keep saying it. She wrung out the shirt and hung it on the line, and behind her she heard Caleb Mercer's boots on the dry ground as he went back to whatever he had been doing before Victor Kane had ridden onto his property and made himself at home in the middle of someone else's afternoon. She did not make any decisions that day. She finished the laundry and walked back to town and ate supper at Mrs. Halverson's and lay on her bed in the small room and looked at the ceiling for a long time, working through what she knew. Victor Kane had legal standing, or claimed to. He had Dade Ferris. He had money and reputation and 2 years of history in this territory that she didn't have. He had the kind of presence that made people step aside without knowing exactly why they were doing it. She had $11.25. She had replaced what she spent on the doctor, mostly, and $1.75 a week and a reputation, such as it was, as the woman who had been thrown into the street on her first day in town. And she had Emmett Hollis's name and address written in Caleb Mercer's handwriting on a torn piece of paper that he had pressed into her hand when she left the ranch, along with her wages for the week. She held the piece of paper in the dark and thought about what Victor had said. You have nothing. It was probably true, measured in the currency he used to measure things. But she had gotten herself upright off the dirt floor of Red Hollow's main street without anyone's help, and she had found work, and she had walked 4 miles in bad boots to get it, and she had stood in a wash shed while Victor Kane tried to make her feel like a problem he was going to solve, and she had not backed down, and she was still here. She folded the paper and tucked it beside her in the bed and closed her eyes. She was still here. The piece of paper with Emmett Hollis's name on it stayed folded beside her pillow for 4 more days before Clara did anything about it. She wasn't stalling, exactly. She was thinking. There was a difference, though she understood that from the outside it might look the same. She had learned in the weeks since she had arrived in Red Hollow that moving too fast in an unfamiliar place had a cost, and that the cost was usually paid by whoever had the least standing to absorb it. She needed to be sure before she set anything in motion, because once she set it in motion, she was not the kind of woman who could stop herself from following it to the end. She went back to the Mercer Ranch on Wednesday morning as usual, walked the 4 miles in the boots that had started to develop a hole in the left heel, and spent the morning with Dolores working through a backlog of ranch hands' laundry that smelled powerfully of horse and hard work. Dolores talked while they worked. Not constantly, but in the way of a woman who had decided that silence was fine but didn't need to be protected. She talked about the weather, about a disagreement she was having with the cook at the Halverson place over a borrowed pot, about a bird that had built a nest in the eave above the wash shed door. Clara listened and responded and wrung shirts and hung them on the line, and somewhere around mid-morning she said, How long have you known Caleb Mercer? Dolores considered the question as she would consider the appropriate amount of salt in a pot of beans, with genuine thought and no particular hurry. Since he was 22, she said. I knew his father before him, came to work here when Caleb's mother got sick, and never found a reason to leave. She handed Clara one end of a sheet to pull straight. Why? I'm trying to understand him, Clara said. What do you want to understand? Why he helps people. Dolores looked at her from the other end of the sheet. You think there needs to be a reason? There's always a reason, Clara said. With most people. With most people, yes. Dolores snapped her end of the sheet and they folded it between them. Caleb's not most people. He's not complicated that way. She set the folded sheet in the basket. His wife died 4 years ago. Fever. They'd been married 3 years and she was a good woman. He took it hard in the way that quiet men take things hard, which is to say, he didn't talk about it, and he didn't stop working, and he didn't do anything you could point to. And then about a year later, he was just different, more careful with people, more attentive to what they needed. She picked up the next sheet. He's not trying to fix anything. He just pays attention. Clara thought about that. About the man who had walked out of the post office and stopped at the notice board and offered her information without making it feel like charity. About the way he had said it's the right thing, like it was an explanation that needed no defense. He mentioned a lawyer, she said. Emmett Hollis. I know Emmett Hollis, Dolores said. Old man. Smells like pipe tobacco, and he'll interrupt you 3 times before you finish a sentence. But he's sharp, and he doesn't owe anything to anyone in this county, which is rarer than it should be. She looked at Clara directly. Are you going to go see him? I'm thinking about it. Stop thinking and go, Dolores said, with the finality of a woman who had seen enough indecision cost enough people enough time. Victor Kane is not thinking about it. Victor Kane is acting. Clara knew that was true. She had seen Victor twice more in town since his visit to the ranch, and both times he had been coming or going from Dade Ferris's office, and both times he had seen her and done nothing, no acknowledgement, no threat, which was somehow more unnerving than if he had said something. A man who stopped making visible moves had started making invisible ones. I'll go Friday, Clara said. Go tomorrow, Dolores said. She went the next morning. Button. Emmett Hollis's office was in Alton, which was, as Caleb had said, a 2-hour ride east. Clara did not have a horse, which meant it was a considerably longer walk, which meant she had to be up before dawn to cover the ground and still arrive at a reasonable hour. She did not tell anyone she was going. She left Mrs. Halverson's boarding house in the dark with a heel of bread wrapped in cloth in her bandaged hand. The stitches were out now, the wound closing cleanly, and walked east on the road out of Red Hollow as the sky went from black to gray to the particular pale gold of a cold autumn morning. She arrived in Alton at 9:30. Emmett Hollis's office was a narrow room above a hardware store, accessible by an outside staircase that shook in a way that suggested it was one bad winter away from coming away from the building entirely. The door at the top was unlocked. Inside, an extremely old man with white hair and a pipe that he was not currently smoking, but was holding in his hand like a scepter, sat behind a desk that was covered in papers in a way that looked chaotic until you noticed that the chaos had a system. He looked up when she came in. Clara Whitmore, she said. Caleb Mercer sent me. Sit down, he said. Tell me everything. Don't leave anything out because you think it reflects badly on you. Everything reflects badly on someone, and I need the accurate version, not the flattering one. She sat down and told him everything. She was in the office for 1 hour and 40 minutes. In that time, Emmett Hollis interrupted her 11 times. She counted, partly because she had nothing else to do with the part of her mind that wasn't talking, with questions that were sharp and specific and occasionally uncomfortable. He wanted dates. He wanted names. He wanted to know the exact words Victor had used both in Abilene and at the wash shed. And when she couldn't remember the exact words, she said so, and he nodded like that was an acceptable answer. At the end of it, he set his unlit pipe on the desk and looked at her. You have grounds? He said. The question is whether you have the stomach for what the process looks like. Tell me what it looks like. It looks like Victor Kane's lawyer, Dade Ferris, which is not a good draw for you. Ferris is competent and he's connected. Making the case that you are a difficult and unstable woman who abandoned a lawful marriage for personal reasons that have nothing to do with any legitimate grievance. It looks like your character being picked apart in front of a room full of people, some of whom will have already decided what kind of woman you are. It looks like it taking a long time and costing money you probably don't have. He picked up the pipe again. And it looks like Victor Kane having every opportunity to make your life unpleasant in the meanwhile. Manika. He's already doing that, Clara said. He'll do it more systematically, Hollis said. When men like Kane feel cornered, they don't panic. They methodically remove whatever they see as threatening them. That means your work, your housing, your social standing, such as it is. Anyone who's been visible in supporting you. Clara thought of Caleb Mercer, of Dolores, of Dr. Webb, who had stitched her hand and told her about the boarding house. I understand, she said. Do you want me to take the case? What are your fees? He told her. She did the arithmetic in her head. I can't pay that up front, she said. I'm aware of that. I'll take 40% of whatever damages are awarded, if any are. If there are none, I'll take what you can reasonably give at the end of it and call it square. He looked at her. I don't usually do that. I'm doing it because Caleb Mercer asked me to and because I've known about Victor Kane for 2 years and I've been waiting for someone with standing to complain about him. Clara looked at the old man across the desk, at the pipe and the white hair and the papers in their organized chaos, at the eyes that were sharp and direct and entirely without sentiment. Yes, she said, I want you to take it. He held out his hand across the desk and she shook it, and that was that. She walked back to Red Hollow in the afternoon, arriving just before dark with sore feet and a strange lightness in her chest that she was careful not to mistake for confidence. It wasn't confidence. It was the feeling of having done something irreversible, and the way that the irreversibility of a thing, once you'd gotten past the terror of it, had a certain clarity to it. She had set something in motion. It was moving now. She couldn't call it back. She ate supper at Mrs. Halverson's and went to bed and slept more soundly than she had since she'd arrived in the territory. She told Caleb Mercer the following morning when she arrived at the ranch. He was by the barn, checking the shoe on a gray mare who was in a mood about it, and he listened without interrupting while Clara told him she had seen Hollis and retained him, and when she had finished, he just nodded. "Ferris will hear about it by the end of the week," he said. "Kane probably already knows." "I know." He straightened up from the horse's hoof and looked at her. "You should think about whether you want to stay at Halverson's." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Halverson runs a business and she has other boarders, and Kane is a man who makes things uncomfortable for people who get in his way. She's a sensible woman. She might decide a vacant room is preferable to the attention." Clara had thought about this, actually. She had thought about it on the long walk back from Alton in the dark. "Do you have a suggestion?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the mare, who had settled somewhat. "There's a room in the house," he said. "It's not large. It was the housekeeper's room before Dolores moved into the cottage. It has a window and a stove and its own door to the outside." He picked up the mare's hoof again. "I'm not offering it as charity. You'd add 2 days of work to your current 3, and the room would be your wages for those days. It would be a business arrangement." Clara looked at him, at the side of his face, since he was bent over the horse again. "You said Victor Kane would make things uncomfortable for people who got in his way." "I know what I said. And you're still offering." "It's my property," he said. "Kane doesn't get to tell me who works on it." "He might try," Clara said. Caleb glanced up at her, something in his expression, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "He can try," he said. Clara stood in the yard for a moment with the morning light coming through the gaps in the barn boards and the gray mare making her feelings known about the whole situation. "I'll think about it," she said. "Door's open," he said. "Figuratively. Literally, it sticks in cold weather." She moved to the Mercer Ranch 10 days later, after Victor Kane had a conversation with Mrs. Halverson that Clara was not present for, but heard about secondhand from the traveling salesman, who had overheard it through the thin walls of the boarding house dining room. Victor had been polite about it, apparently. He had expressed concern about his wife's well-being and her state of mind and suggested gently that providing her with lodging might inadvertently enable behavior that was not in her best interest. He had also mentioned, in passing, that he was on very good terms with the man who held the mortgage on the boarding house building. Mrs. Halverson had given Clara 3 days' notice the following morning. She had been apologetic about it, which Clara credited her for, and she had returned Clara's last week's payment in full, which Clara credited her for more. The room at the Mercer Ranch was small, as advertised. It had a window that looked east, a wood stove that required a specific technique with the damper that Dolores demonstrated once and expected her to remember, and a door to the outside that did in fact stick badly in cold weather. The walls were plain board, and the floor was plain wood, and there was a shelf along one wall and a hook behind the door, and that was essentially the extent of it. Clara hung her 2 spare dresses on the hook, put her books on the shelf. She had 3, which she had carried from home to Abilene, and then to Red Hollow, and now to the ranch, because she had refused to leave them behind at any point regardless of the weight, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked around the room. It was the first space, she realized, that was entirely hers, not shared with a father and his new family, not rented for a fixed duration, not occupied under the condition of someone else's approval. She had worked for it. The lock on the door was hers. She felt something she couldn't name exactly. Not happiness, which seemed like too large and uncomplicated a word for it. Something smaller and more specific. Something that had to do with walls. What? The days at the ranch developed their own structure, the way days do when you let them. She was up before Dolores most mornings, which impressed Dolores more than she let on. She started the stove and had coffee ready before the ranch hands came in for the day, and she did the laundry on her 3 days, and on the other 2 she helped Dolores with whatever needed doing, mending, food preservation, the general maintenance of a working household that required constant small attention. She also, on her own initiative, started keeping the household accounts. Because she had looked at the ledger on Caleb's desk while returning a pen she had borrowed and noticed that it was 3 months behind. She had not asked permission. She had simply begun. Caleb had come into the main room one evening to find her at his desk with the ledger open and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow. And he had stood in the doorway for a moment before he said, "Did I hire you to do that?" "You hired me to be useful," she said, without looking up. "The ledger is 3 months behind, and you've been overcharged twice by the feed merchant. I've been working on it for 4 days." He was quiet for a moment. "Have you found the errors?" "Yes, I've written them up. You're owed about $6 back." She turned a page. "I'll finish by Thursday." He came in and poured himself coffee and sat down across the room from her and read without saying anything further about it. That was how things tended to go between them. Not silent exactly, but economical. He said what was necessary, and she said what was necessary, and neither of them required more of the other than that. She liked that about the ranch. She hadn't expected to like it as much as she did. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something harder, something that required more performance. What she found instead was that Caleb Mercer ran his operation on the principle that people who knew what they were doing should be left to do it, and people who didn't know what they were doing should be told clearly and then left to do it, and that checking in constantly on either category was a waste of everyone's time. The ranch hands, 5 of them, ranging from a 17-year-old named Toby, who was cheerful and accident-prone, to a 50-year-old named Walt, who had apparently been present at the construction of the original barn and had opinions about every subsequent modification, were initially uncertain about her presence. She was neither family nor hired hand in the traditional sense, and the territory between those two categories was unfamiliar. Within 2 weeks, she had, without particularly trying to, established herself as the person who kept the household running efficiently and would tell you plainly if you tracked mud across the clean floor. It was not a comfortable life, precisely. It was a life with edges. She was still a married woman living on another man's property in a territory where that had a meaning she couldn't entirely control. Emmett Hollis sent periodic letters updating her on the status of the legal proceedings, which were slow and complicated and requiring documentation she sometimes had to think hard about how to obtain. Victor Kane was still in Red Hollow, still meeting with Dade Ferris, still moving through the territory with the unhurried assurance of a man who had not yet been told that the ground he was standing on could shift. She thought about him less than she had in the first weeks. That was the strangest part of it. The way that filling her days with work that mattered had pushed Victor Kane from the center of her attention toward the periphery of it. He was still there. She wasn't naive enough to believe otherwise. But he occupied a specific space now, a contained and bordered space, rather than bleeding into everything the way he had in the early days when she couldn't look at a locked door without calculating the distance to it. She mentioned this to Dolores one afternoon, obliquely, the way you mention things to Dolores, which was obliquely or not at all. "You're not scared anymore," Dolores said. It wasn't a question. "I am scared," Clara said. "I'm just not only scared." Dolores considered this. "That's better," she said. Poet. The first real trouble came on a Saturday in late October. Clara had gone into Red Hollow to collect a package from Emmett Hollis that he had sent by post rather than messenger, because it contained copies of documents he needed her to verify, dates and places that she had to confirm from memory. She had gone in the morning, early, when the town was still quiet. She had collected the package and was on her way back through the main street when she heard someone say her name. It was a woman she recognized vaguely, the wife of one of the men who ran the stockyards, a woman named Muriel Cates, who had an angular face and a manner that suggested she had formed opinions about most things and was not looking to revise them. "Mrs. Kane," she said, though the way she said it made it clear she knew exactly what was complicated about that title. "Mrs. Cates," Clara said. Muriel Cates was standing with 2 other women whose names Clara didn't know, in front of the millinery shop that had declined to hire her. All 3 of them had the particular quality of people who have been discussing something and have recently been interrupted by the arrival of the subject of that discussion. "I heard you've taken up residence on the Mercer Ranch," Muriel said. "I work at the Mercer Ranch," Clara said. The sound Muriel Cates made was precisely calibrated. Not quite accusatory, not quite neutral, sitting in the territory between them that was most damaging. Victor was in church last Sunday, she said, which Clara had not expected, and which landed with a small internal jolt she was careful not to show. He said he's been trying to reconcile with you, that he's very concerned. I'm sure he is, Clara said. He seems like a reasonable man, said one of the other women, whose name Clara did not know and was not going to learn today. Clara looked at her. She thought about what Emmett Hollis had said, about her character being picked apart in front of a room full of people who had already decided. She thought about the wash shed and Victor's voice saying, "You have nothing." She thought about the ledger she had corrected and the accounts she had straightened and the specific satisfaction of having found the errors. I'm sure he seems that way, Clara said evenly. Have a good morning. She walked away before any of them could respond. She walked with her back straight and her package under her arm and her eyes on the road in front of her. And she did not look back, and she covered the 4 miles to the ranch in less time than usual, because anger is a reasonable fuel if you know how to use it. She was in the yard, still in her coat, when Caleb came out of the barn. He looked at her. What happened? Women in town, she said. Victor has been building a reputation for himself. Concerned husband, reasonable man. She set the package down on the fence post. He's doing what you said he would. Yes, Caleb said. It's effective, she said. The anger was cooling now, settling into something more considered. He's good at it. He's had practice. She picked up the package again. I need to write to Hollis tonight. There are some things in this documentation I need to explain to him, and I want to do it while I can still think clearly about them. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then, the ranch hands are going into town Saturday evenings. You shouldn't go alone anymore. I'm not going to arrange my life around what Victor Kane might do, Clara said. I'm not suggesting that, he said. I'm suggesting that there's no tactical reason to be alone in town when you don't have to be. She looked at him. He was right about that, and she knew it. Fine, she said. Good. He went back into the barn. She stood in the yard for a moment with the cold afternoon air around her and the package in her arms, and the slow, clarifying anger working its way through her chest, and she thought, he's trying to turn the town against me before the trial. That was what Victor was doing, building a version of himself, reasonable, concerned, aggrieved, in every social space he could access. It was methodical. It was patient. It was exactly the kind of thing that Victor Kane was good at. She went inside and sat down at the desk and opened the package and began to read. So, 2 weeks later, she went back into Red Hollow of her own volition on a Tuesday morning while Caleb was occupied with a fence repair on the south end of the property and Dolores was visiting her sister. She went to Dade Ferris's office. This was not something she had planned carefully. It was something she had decided, in the way she sometimes decided things, in the hour before dawn, when the cold pressed against the window of her small room and her mind moved through the chessboard of her situation with the patient attention of someone who had nothing else to do at 4 a.m. Victor Kane was operating on the assumption that she was afraid, that her legal action was a defensive reaction, a holding maneuver, something that could be waited out. She was not going to correct this assumption by behaving as though he were right. She was going to walk into the office of his lawyer. Dade Ferris was a man of perhaps 50, with the smooth face of someone who had spent his career indoors and the careful wardrobe of someone who had spent it in proximity to money. His office was on the main street, next to the bank, which was probably not a coincidence. He looked up when Clara came through the door, and he did not look surprised, which suggested that either he was very good at not being surprised or he had been expecting her in some form. Mrs. Kane, he said. Mr. Ferris, she said, I'd like 5 minutes. Anything you want to say to me should properly be said to me through your own legal representation, he said. I expect you know that. I do, she said. I'm not here to discuss the case. I'm here to tell you something that I think you should know. He studied her. He was calculating. She could see it, whether she was about to do something stupid that would help his case or something strategic that he needed to evaluate. Sit down, he said. She sat. I want you to know that I am not going to stop, she said. Whatever Victor has told you about me, that I'm unstable or frightened or that this is an impulsive action I'll eventually withdraw, it isn't accurate. I have retained Emmett Hollis. I am prepared to spend as long as this takes, and I want you, as a professional, to understand that before you invest further resources in a case that isn't going to resolve the way your client expects. Dade Ferris looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Kane," he said, finally, "your husband is a man with significant resources and significant standing in this territory. Whatever you believe about the merits of your position, I believe the merits are substantial," Clara said. "So does Emmett Hollis." Something shifted very slightly in Ferris's expression. The mention of Hollis's name had landed differently than the rest of what she'd said. She noted that. "I appreciate your candor," Ferris said, in a tone that suggested he appreciated it as much as he would appreciate a stone in his boot. "Is there anything else?" "No," she said. She stood. "Thank you for your time." She walked back out into the main street of Red Hollow, with her heart going considerably faster than she would have preferred, and she kept walking until she was off the main street and onto the side street that led to the road east. And then she stood against the wall of the feed store for a moment and breathed. That had been reckless. Possibly. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see what's underneath. Hollis might disagree with her having done it. She would tell him and find out. But she had wanted Ferris to see her, not the woman who had been thrown into the street, not the difficult wife, not the abstraction of a legal problem. Her. A specific person with a specific purpose who was not going to be managed or waited out. Whether it had worked, she wouldn't know for a while. She walked back to the ranch in the cold afternoon air and said nothing to anyone about where she had been. And that evening after supper, when Caleb was reading by the stove in the main room and she was at the desk working on a letter to Hollis, she heard him say, without looking up from his book, "You went into town today." "Yes," she said. "Everything all right?" She considered the question, her hand still moving the pen across the page, the stove ticking with heat, the dark outside the windows. "Getting there," she said. He turned a page. She kept writing. That was the rhythm of it. The slow, hard, daily work of building something out of whatever materials you actually had, which were never the materials you would have chosen and were always somehow just enough. Emmett Hollis's response to Clara's visit to Dade Ferris's office arrived by post 4 days later and consisted of exactly 2 sentences. "That was either very stupid or very smart, and I haven't decided which. Don't do it again without telling me first." She read it twice, then folded it into the file she was keeping on the case, which had grown from a thin sheaf of papers to something that required its own box. Hollis had not said it was wrong. That was the part she held on to. November arrived with the particular cruelty that the high plains reserved for autumn. Not a gradual cooling, but a sudden, decisive drop that felt like the land announcing it was done with the previous season and was moving on regardless of anyone's preferences. The ranch responded to it the way working places respond to cold. More work, earlier mornings, the particular smell of wood smoke that got into everything and stayed. Clara added a second blanket to her bed and started wearing an extra layer under her coat on the walk between the small room and the main house. And she began getting up 30 minutes earlier because the stove took longer to draw in cold weather. She had been at the ranch for almost 2 months. The shape of her days had become familiar enough that she moved through them without having to think about each individual step, which freed up a portion of her mind for thinking about the case, the evidence, the slow machinery of whatever Hollis was constructing in Alton. She had sent him 14 letters. He had sent her 9. The ratio reflected the fact that she had more questions than he had answers, which he had explained was normal and which she accepted while finding it not particularly comforting. What she had not told Hollis, had not told anyone, was that the threats had started. The first one she had found slipped under the door of her room 3 weeks ago. A piece of paper, no signature, that said, in a plain, careful hand, "Drop the case or lose more than you've already lost." She had looked at it for a long time, then put it in the case file behind Hollis's letters, because it was evidence and because putting it somewhere deliberate was better than the alternative, which was to sit with it. The second one had appeared on the seat of the wagon she sometimes used to go into town, tucked under a stone so it wouldn't blow away. Same handwriting, last warning, walk away. She had put that one in the file too. She had not told Caleb. She was aware this was probably a mistake and she had made it deliberately, because the threats were aimed at her and she was not yet ready to make them into someone else's problem. She was trying to determine whether she could absorb them on her own, the way you test the weight of something before deciding you need help carrying it. She was still in the process of making that determination when the third thing happened. Not a note this time, but something physical. She came out of the wash shed on a Wednesday morning to find that the gray mare Caleb had been treating for a thrown shoe, the same horse she had watched him tend that first morning she'd come to ask about the laundry work, was standing in the yard with her halter cut clean through. Not broken. Cut. Someone had been on the property in the night with a knife and enough knowledge of the layout to find the mare in the dark. She stood in the yard looking at the cut leather for a long time before she went inside and told Caleb. He came out and looked at it without saying anything. He walked the perimeter of the yard slowly, reading the ground the way a man who has spent 35 years on a working ranch reads ground. And when he came back, he had the expression of someone who has confirmed a suspicion they did not want confirmed. "How long has this been going on?" he said. He was looking at the cut halter, not at her, but the question was unmistakably about more than the halter. "The note started about 3 weeks ago," she said. He looked at her then. "I know," she said before he could speak. "I should have told you." "Yes," he said simply. "I was trying to—" She stopped. She was trying to think of how to explain the particular calculation she had been making, and she couldn't find a framing for it that didn't sound, even to her, like stubbornness dressed up as strategy. "I didn't want to make it your problem," she said. "It became my problem the moment someone came onto my property and cut my horse's halter," he said. Not angry, but very direct. "Everything that happens on this land is my problem, Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. They both registered it. He looked back at the halter. "I'm going into town today," he said. "I'm going to talk to Sheriff Gaines." "Gaines is—" she started. "Gaines is probably sympathetic to Kane, yes," Caleb said. "But a report puts it on record, and a report on record becomes useful to Hollis." He coiled the cut halter in his hands. "You need to write to Hollis today and tell him about the notes, both of them. They're already in the file, I kept them." He looked at her again. Something shifted in his face. Not quite approval, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man recalculating his understanding of a situation. "Good," he said. She wrote to Hollis that afternoon. She told him about the notes, the halter, the timeline. She kept her language plain and factual, the way Hollis had instructed her in his very first letter. "Tell me what happened, not how it made you feel. The facts are the argument. The feelings are yours." She sealed the letter, and then she sat at the desk for a while with her hands flat on the surface and thought about what it meant that Victor Kane was escalating. Hollis had predicted it, had said, in the very first meeting in his creaking office above the hardware store, that when men like Kane felt cornered, they became more methodical. She had thought she understood what that meant. She was understanding it more concretely now. What? Caleb came back from town in the late afternoon with his face in the careful neutral arrangement that she had come to recognize as his version of controlled anger. "Gaines took the report," he said, hanging his coat. "He was professional about it. He also told me that Victor Kane has filed a counter-complaint, claiming you've been conducting yourself in ways that damage his reputation and business interests." Clara looked up from the letter she was rereading. "He's filing against me?" "It's a move," Caleb said. "Hollis will tell you the same thing. It's designed to complicate your case and give Ferris something to point to in court." He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and stood by the window. "But it also means Kane is feeling the pressure. Men don't file counter-complaints against women with no legal standing and no money. They ignore them." That was true. She had not thought about it that way. "He's taking it seriously," she said. "He's taking you seriously," Caleb said, "which is different from what he wants anyone to see him doing." She put the letter down. "There's something else you should know," she said. "The woman I mentioned before, Muriel Cates. When I was in town last week to see the Post, I spoke with her sister. Her name is Frances. She pulled me aside on the street and asked if there was somewhere she could talk to me privately." Clara paused. "Frances Cates has bruises under her collar. I saw them when the wind moved her scarf." Caleb was very still. "She didn't say anything directly," Clara said, "but she asked me questions about Hollis, about the process, about what it cost. She said she was asking for a friend." Clara looked at her hands. "She wasn't asking for a friend. Does she have a husband who runs with Kane's people?" "I don't know his associations. His name is Denton Cates. He owns property on the North Road." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "What did you tell her?" I told her the process and the timeline and what it costs and what it doesn't cost, Clara said. I told her Emmett Hollis's name, and I told her he works on a sliding scale. I told her she could write to me at this address if she wanted to talk more. She looked up. I don't know if she will. He nodded. He was still looking out the window at the gray afternoon. You should tell Hollis, he said. I know. There was a pause between them. Not uncomfortable. The way silences between people who have learned to share space can be not uncomfortable. Clara, he said, still looking at the window. What you're doing, going to see Ferris, finding Francis Cates, keeping those notes, you understand that this is getting larger than one case. I know, she said again. He looked at her then. Are you all right with that? It was a genuine question. She took it seriously. I'm not sure all right is the right word, she said, but I'm not going to stop. He nodded slowly. Then we figure out what comes next, he said. Bob, Francis Cates wrote 3 weeks later. It was a short letter, careful and indirect, the kind of letter written by someone who was very aware that letters could be read by other people. She asked about the weather. She mentioned that her sister Muriel was well. She said she had been thinking about a conversation they'd had and wondered if Mrs. Kane would be willing to meet for coffee sometime. Clara wrote back and named a time and a place, Dr. Webb's office, because Webb had been discreet and because his office had a back room that could be accessed from the alley, which she mentioned to Webb when she stopped in to ask if they might use it. Webb had looked at her and said simply, "Of course," without asking what for. Francis Cates arrived at the back entrance of Dr. Webb's office on a Tuesday morning looking like a woman who had rehearsed being casual and had not quite managed it. She was perhaps 40, with the same angular quality as her sister, but softer, something ground down in her rather than sharpened. The bruises Clara had seen at the collar were different ones now, which meant they were new. They sat across from each other in Webb's back room while the sound of the main office filtered through the wall and Francis Cates talked. It took her 20 minutes to stop speaking in the indirect mode, the weather, the friend, the hypothetical, and Clara didn't push. She waited. She had learned from Emmett Hollis that waiting was one of the most useful things you could do. When Francis finally said, "I'm not asking for a friend," Clara just nodded and said, "I know. I've been waiting for you to get there." Something broke loose in Francis Cates then, not dramatically. She didn't weep, didn't raise her voice. She just started speaking plainly, the way people speak when they've been carrying a language of indirection for so long that plain speech feels like setting something very heavy down. Her husband, Denton Cates, had been hurting her for 9 years. She had not told anyone because Denton Cates was a man with property and a good standing in the territory, and because, as she said, looking at her hands, "I didn't think it would do any good." She paused. "And then you stood up in the middle of the main street and walked back to the ranch, and I watched you, and I thought—" She stopped again. "What did you think?" Clara said. "That you didn't look like you thought it would do any good either," Francis said. "But you were doing it anyway." Clara looked at her. "I'm not sure it will," she said honestly. "I don't know how this ends." "Neither do I," Francis said. "But I'd rather not know with something happening than not know with nothing happening." Clara reached across and put her bandaged hand. The scar from the scrape had faded to a thin line, barely visible. On the table between them, not touching Francis's hand, just placing it there. "Tell me what you need," she said. "Tell me what you have. We'll figure out what comes next from there." The letter from Hollis arrived at the end of November with a court date, the 15th of February, 12 weeks away. The letter ran to 4 pages, which was unusual for Hollis, and outlined what he had. The documentation of the marriage, Clara's testimony, the medical record from Dr. Webb that had been logged the day she arrived in Red Hollow, and what he needed, which was more witnesses and more corroboration of Victor Kane's pattern of behavior. He had, he wrote, been doing some research of his own into Victor Kane's history. What he had found was useful but incomplete. He needed Clara to think carefully about whether she knew of anyone else, in Abilene, in the other towns Kane had moved through, who might have a story that looked like hers. She read the letter twice and then sat with it for a while. She knew of 2 women. She had not known them well, but she had known them, in the way you know people in the social orbit of a man you are considering marrying, cautiously, briefly, across the carefully managed distance that Victor had always maintained between her and anyone who might tell her something inconvenient. One of them had been in Abilene. Her name was Ruth. The other had been mentioned in passing, in a letter that Victor had left lying on a table in the hotel room in a way that might or might not have been deliberate, and whose name she had only half seen before she understood that she shouldn't be reading it. She wrote all of this to Hollis. She told him about Ruth in Abilene, her last name, where she had lived, what she could remember. She told him about the letter and the partial name and the fact that she might be wrong about what she had seen. She also, in a separate section of the letter, told him about Francis Cates. December arrived, and with it the particular stillness of a ranch in winter, the way the cold pressed down on everything and made the days shorter and the work more concentrated. Clara had been at the Mercer Ranch for almost 4 months. She had stopped counting the weeks somewhere in the middle of November, which she took as a sign that she had stopped waiting for her stay to be temporary. It was during this period, the cold, quiet weeks before Christmas, that she started asking Caleb to show her things. She didn't frame it that way. She simply began paying attention to things he did around the ranch and asking questions about them. And he answered the questions, and then she asked more. And somewhere in that process, it became something that happened deliberately. He showed her how to read the weather coming off the hills to the north. He showed her the specific calculation that went into deciding when to move cattle and when to hold them. He showed her how to handle the rifle that hung above the door of the main house. Not because he suggested she should know, but because she asked. That last one he had not expected. He had been cleaning it on a Sunday afternoon when she came into the main room and said, "Will you show me how to use that?" He had looked at her for a moment. "Do you know anything about firearms?" "No," she said. "That's why I'm asking." He had set down the cleaning cloth and spent the next 2 hours showing her, first in the main room and then outside in the yard, how to load and aim and fire and absorb the recoil that she had not been prepared for the first time and that had nearly knocked her backward. She fired 12 shots at a fence post. She hit it 4 times, which was not impressive and which she was honest about. "Again," she said. They went out again the next Sunday and she hit it 7 times. He didn't say anything about why she was learning this. She didn't explain. They both understood. The fire happened on the 14th of December, in the early hours of a morning that had been clear and cold with a wind from the north that did what north winds do. Clara woke to the smell of smoke. That was the first thing. Not the sound, not the light, just the smell, slipping under the door of her small room with the specific quality of burning wood that is not in a stove. She was out of bed and in her coat and boots before she was fully awake, moving on instinct. And when she opened the door, she saw the light. The barn was burning, not starting to burn. Already burning. The fire well into the roof by the time she got outside, the north wind doing exactly what north winds do with an established fire, which was make it worse. The sound was something she had not been prepared for, a roaring that was low and constant and somehow angrier than she had expected fire to sound. She ran toward the main house, shouting. Caleb was already coming out the door. He had smelled it too, or heard it, or had the instinct of a man who has been responsible for a place long enough that it wakes him when something is wrong with it. Behind him, she could hear the ranch hands coming from the bunkhouse. The horses. That was the first thought. The horses were in the barn, the 6 horses that were the working core of the ranch. Caleb was already running toward the barn doors, and Clara ran with him, and the heat when they got close was a physical force, something you leaned against. The doors were not yet fully burning. The fire had started in the roof, not at the base, and the structure was still partially accessible. What happened in the next 20 minutes she would remember afterward in pieces that did not entirely assemble into sequence. Caleb and Walt going into the barn and bringing out 2 horses, then 3. The animals wild-eyed and fighting the lead ropes. The roof groaning with a sound like a ship in a storm. Toby appearing at her shoulder with a bucket. There was a well 40 feet from the barn, and it was already clear that 40 feet was not close enough, and that buckets were not going to stop this. But you do what is possible because the alternative is nothing. Dolores at the edge of the yard with a blanket around her shoulders, watching. They got all 6 horses out. The barn was not savable. She stood in the cold dark at the edge of the yard with the heat of the fire on her face and watched the structure collapse in on itself, the roof going first with a sound like an exhalation. And then the walls. And then there was just fire where the barn had been, still burning in the wreckage, orange and relentless in the dark. Caleb stood beside her. He had a burn on the back of his left hand from where a falling piece of the roof had grazed him. She had wrapped it with what she had available, a strip of cloth from her coat pocket, but he needed Webb's attention. He was looking at the fire. It didn't start from inside, Walt said. He had walked the outside perimeter in the dark while they were getting the horses out, reading the ground the way he read everything. No lamp fell, no coal escaped. The fire started at the north wall, outside, about halfway up. Nobody said the name. After a moment, Caleb said, "We need to document this before anything shifts. Walt, can you—" "Already doing it," Walt said, and moved back toward the ruin. Clara stood in the cold with the fire dying in front of her and felt something she had been keeping carefully contained for 4 months shift and change. Not break. It didn't break, but it changed form. It became something harder and less patient. She went inside and lit the lamp on the desk and sat down and wrote a letter to Emmett Hollis. It was 4:30 in the morning. She told him about the fire. She told him what Walt had found. She told him about the notes she had kept, the cut halter, the dates of everything. She wrote for an hour without stopping, and when she finished, she had 6 pages of plain, factual documentation, and her hand was cramping from the cold and the speed. She addressed it and set it by the door to go out with the morning mail, and then she went back to the ruins of the barn, where Caleb and Walt and Toby were still working by lamplight to assess what was salvageable. And she helped. Sheriff Gaines came out the next day. He was professional about it. He walked the perimeter, he took notes, he asked questions. He did not say anything that indicated he believed the fire had been set or that he intended to pursue it as arson. He said it was a difficult thing, and he was sorry about it, and that fires happened on working ranches. He said all of this looking at the edge of the ruin rather than at Caleb. Caleb thanked him for coming and said nothing else. After Gaines left, Clara said, "He's not going to do anything." "No," Caleb said. "He's not going to file a report that implicates Kane." "No." "So we have our documentation and Hollis's file, and we have nothing else." Caleb looked at her. "We have 10 weeks until February 15th, he said, "and we have something Kane didn't expect." "What?" He looked at the place where the barn had been. "He thought burning the barn would make us stop," he said. "It makes me angry." "Those are different things." Clara looked at him. At the burn on the back of his hand, the wrapped cloth she had put there at 4 in the morning, the particular quality of stillness he had that she had come to understand was not passivity, but its opposite. "I need to go to town," she said. "I know," he said. "Not alone." "No," she agreed. "Not alone." She went to Francis Cates first. They met again in Dr. Webb's back room, and this time Frances brought someone with her. A woman named Ida Marsh, who lived on a homestead 12 miles north of town, and who sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at Clara with the measuring eyes of someone who had learned a long time ago to be careful about who they trusted. "Frances told me what you're doing," Ida said. "What am I doing?" Clara said. "Taking Victor Kane to court." "Yes. My husband worked for Kane," Ida said, 3 years ago. There was a dispute about wages, and Kane had him run off the property by 2 men with rifles. He broke 2 ribs in the process." She paused. "Nobody in this town was going to hear about it. But if you're going to court, I'll tell it to a judge." Clara looked at her, at Frances beside her, at the 2 women sitting across a table in the back room of a doctor's office in a small town that had mostly decided to look away from whatever was inconvenient, because looking away was easier and safer and asked less of you. "I'll need you to write it down," Clara said. "Dates, names, what happened. I'll send it to my lawyer and he'll tell us what form it needs to take." Ida nodded. "There may be more women," Clara said. "If either of you know of others, if you know of anyone who has a story that looks like yours, I need to know." Frances and Ida exchanged a look. The look of 2 women who have been carrying a shared knowledge that they were not permitted to speak aloud. "There are others," Frances said. "How many?" "Enough," Ida said. Clara looked at them both. She thought of Hollis's letter. "I've been doing some research into Victor Kane's history, and the 4 pages of legal strategy, and Ruth and Abilene, and the partial name in the letter she wasn't supposed to have seen. I need to speak with all of them," she said. "Separately or together, whatever they're comfortable with. Will you help me arrange it?" Frances looked at her hands. Then she looked up. "Yes," she said. Ida said nothing, which Clara had already come to understand was Ida's version of yes. She rode back to the ranch that evening with Toby, who had come with her as Caleb had insisted, and she sat in the wagon with the cold air moving around her and the stars beginning to come out over the plains, and she thought about what Hollis had said in the last letter, the 4-page one. The facts are the argument. She was gathering facts. The woman who had been thrown into the street 4 months ago, the woman who had sat on the bench outside the post office with $11 in a busted hand and no particular reason to believe anything was going to turn out all right. That woman had started something. She couldn't see the shape of it yet. She couldn't see the end. But she could see that it was larger than she had meant it to be, and that it was growing, and that Victor Kane's barn fire, his neat, methodical, cowardly barn fire, had not stopped it. It had made it harder to stop. Toby said from beside her on the wagon seat, "You all right, ma'am?" "Yes," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and clicked at the horse, and they went on down the road toward the ranch. The weeks between December and February had a quality that Clara would later describe to no one, because there was no one she trusted enough with the particular texture of that waiting. The way time moved in 2 speeds simultaneously, too slow in the evenings when there was nothing to do but think, and too fast in the mornings when she looked at the calendar and calculated how many days remained before the 15th. Hollis wrote twice in January. The first letter was logistical, what she should wear, how she should speak, what Ferris would try to do to her on cross-examination, and how she should respond to each category of attack. He wrote it the way a man writes a field manual, with the assumption that the person reading it was intelligent enough to apply the principles without being told to. She read it 4 times and then summarized it in her own words in her case journal, which had grown to fill 2 notebooks. The second letter contained a name she had not expected. Ruth Alderman, Abilene. Hollis had found her. Ruth Alderman had agreed to provide a written statement. She would not come to Red Hollow in person. She had children and a new situation and could not take the risk. But her statement, Hollis wrote, was detailed and credible and corroborated Clara's account in 3 specific ways that he did not elaborate on in the letter, because letters could be intercepted and he had stopped trusting Red Hollow's mail handling somewhere around December. Clara sat with that letter for a long time. Ruth Alderman. She had met her twice, briefly, in Abilene, a quiet woman with careful eyes who had been pointed out to Clara at a social gathering as someone who had been briefly acquainted with Victor before his attention had turned elsewhere. Clara had not thought much about it at the time. She thought about it now. By the end of January, Hollis had 6 witnesses. Clara knew about 4 of them. He had asked her to stop trying to find out about the other 2, for reasons he did not explain, but which she understood had to do with protecting them from whatever Victor Kane might do if he knew who was planning to testify. The women she had gathered through Frances and Ida, 4 of them, eventually, who had agreed to come forward in some form, had given their statements in Hollis's presence during a single long day in Alton in mid-January. Clara had not been there for the statements. Hollis had asked her not to be, for reasons of legal process that he explained with more patience than she had expected from him. She had driven the women to Alton in Caleb's wagon, 2 trips over 2 days, and left them at Hollis's door, and waited outside on the steps, and driven them back. Frances Cates was one of them. She had come on the second trip in the wagon with Ida Marsh and a woman named Constance who had not spoken once during either journey, but had arrived at Hollis's office and spent 45 minutes inside it and come out looking scraped clean. Not lighter, exactly, but emptied of something that had been taking up too much space. On the drive back, Ida had said to Clara, without preamble, "Your husband's men burned your barn." "Yes," Clara said. "Are you afraid of what they'll do next?" Clara kept her eyes on the road. The plains in January were the color of old bone, flat and colorless under a white sky. "Yes," she said, "but I've been afraid since October, and it hasn't stopped me from doing anything I needed to do, so I'm not sure it's the most relevant piece of information I have about myself." Ida had said nothing to that, which was Ida's version of agreement. Caleb had started rebuilding the barn in January, on the days when the weather permitted it, which were not many. He worked with Walt and Toby and a hired man from a neighboring ranch who had carpentry skills, and the structure went up slowly in the cold, the new wood pale against the gray sky. Clara helped when she could, not with the framing, which required a skill she didn't have, but with the hauling and the mixing and the fetching that surrounded any construction project, and that nobody talked about but everyone depended on. They worked side by side one afternoon in the flat gray light of a January Thursday, hauling planks from a delivery wagon to the site. And Caleb said, without particular preamble, "How are you holding up?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm better when I'm working," she said. "Most people are." "I'm worse in the evenings," she said. "I think about what Ferris is going to say about me, and I run through Hollis's instructions, and I can't stop the thinking once it starts." She picked up one end of a plank. "It's manageable. I'm not telling you it's worse than it is." He took the other end. "I know," he said. "I'm asking because I want to know, not because I'm looking for a particular answer." They carried the plank to the site in silence. On the way back for the next one, she said, "Are you worried about the trial? About the outcome? About any of it?" He stopped walking and looked at her directly, which he did when he wanted to make sure what he was saying landed. "I'm worried about what it costs you," he said, "not the legal outcome. What it costs you to stand in a room full of people and tell the truth while someone tries to make you feel like the truth is the problem." She held his gaze for a moment. "I can do that," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I still worry about it." She looked at him, at this man who had not asked to be in the middle of any of this, who had offered a job and a room and a name on a piece of paper and had ended up with his barn burned down and his property threatened and a woman's legal battle running through the center of his winter, who had not once indicated in word or manner that he regretted any of it. "Why?" she said, not challenging, genuinely asking. He picked up the next plank. "Because some things are worth worrying about," he said, which was, she had come to understand, the most direct answer Caleb Mercer was likely to give to that kind of question. She took the other end of the plank, and they carried it to the site. The 15th of February arrived, the way days you have been dreading always arrive, with complete indifference to the fact that you have been bracing for them. Clara was up before the sky lightened. She put on the dress she had set aside for the occasion, her dark wool dress, the best thing she owned, which Dolores had pressed the night before without being asked, and she did her hair with more care than usual, not because she wanted to look decorative, but because she understood that how you looked was part of what people in that room were going to use to form opinions about you. And she was not going to hand them anything unnecessary. She came out of her room into the cold morning and found Dolores at the stove with coffee and a plate of food she hadn't asked for. "Eat," Dolores said. "I'm not hungry." "I didn't ask if you were hungry," Dolores said. Clara sat down and ate. Caleb was hitching the wagon when she came outside. He was wearing his good coat, which she had only seen twice before. He looked at her when she came out and said nothing, but the look was the kind that registered something. The dress, the set of her shoulders, the fact that she was here and doing this. Toby and Walt were both coming. She had not expected that. They appeared from the bunkhouse in clean shirts with their hats in their hands, with the slightly formal, uncomfortable manner of men who do not regularly attend legal proceedings and are taking the occasion seriously. She looked at them and something tight in her chest shifted sideways. "You don't have to come," she said. "We know," Walt said, with the finality of a man who has already made his decision and does not require discussion. They drove into Red Hollow in the wagon with the cold morning light coming sideways off the plains, and Clara sat in the front beside Caleb and watched the town grow from a smudge on the horizon to a collection of buildings to a place she knew, and she kept her hands flat in her lap because her fingers wanted to shake, and she was not going to let them. So, the Red Hollow courthouse was a single large room attached to the back of the town hall, with benches on both sides and a raised platform at the front, where Judge Calvin Pruitt presided. Pruitt was a man from the territorial capital who had been brought in specifically because Hollis had filed a motion arguing that the local bench had conflicts of interest, a motion that had taken 6 weeks to succeed and that Hollis had described as the most important procedural victory of the case. The room was full. Clara had not expected that. She had expected a modest attendance, lawyers and witnesses, and perhaps a few curious townspeople. What she found was a room packed to the walls with people standing along the sides and pressing at the doors, and a quality of attention that was not exactly hostile but was not comfortable either. Red Hollow had been watching this case for 4 months. Today was when it resolved. She walked down the center aisle with her chin up and her eyes on the front of the room, and she was aware of the people on both sides of her in the way you are aware of weather. as a condition of the environment, something to be noted and navigated, not something that was going to determine where she went. Victor Kane was already seated at the defendant's table with Dade Ferris beside him. He was dressed impeccably, which she had expected. He looked at her when she walked in with the expression she knew best from him, the evaluating one, the one that reduced her to a problem. And she met it and held it for exactly 1 second before she looked away. Emmett Hollis was waiting for her at the plaintiff's table. He stood when she approached and looked her over the way he had looked over the documents she'd sent him, with the rapid, assessing attention of a man checking for errors before a submission. "Good," he said. Just that. She sat down beside him and placed her hands on the table and looked at the front of the room and breathed. The first hour of this trial was procedural. Motions and objections and the particular language of legal process that Hollis had walked her through in his letters, but that was still strange to hear in actual deployment, compressed and technical, with none of the explanatory patience he had used when writing to her. Judge Pruitt ran his courtroom with the efficiency of a man who had no interest in extended performances. He cut off Ferris twice in the first 30 minutes on points of procedure, which Hollis registered with the micro-expression of a man receiving good news he had been expecting. Then Hollis called his first witness. It was Dr. Aldous Webb. Webb came to the stand with the same manner he had in his office, the dark circles under his eyes, the direct attention. And he testified in plain medical language about what he had observed when Clara came through his door on the afternoon of her arrival in Red Hollow. The bruising, the abraded palm requiring stitches, the pattern of the injuries that was, in his professional assessment, consistent with a fall following physical force rather than with a simple stumble. Ferris cross-examined him with careful, measured skepticism, questioning his certainty, pointing out that he had not witnessed any event, only its aftermath. Webb answered each question exactly as precisely as the question required, no more, which was the most useful thing a witness could do and which Hollis had clearly impressed on him. When Webb stepped down, Clara saw Muriel Cates, Francis's sister, the woman who had told her Victor seemed reasonable, shift on the bench behind the defendant's table. Muriel was watching with an expression that was harder to read now than it had been in October. Hollis called 2 more witnesses before midday, a man named Carson, who had worked a cattle deal with Victor Kane 3 years ago in another county, and who described a pattern of contract manipulation that had left him financially ruined, and a woman named Constance, who was the quiet woman from the second wagon trip to Alton, and who stood in the witness box and spoke in a voice so controlled it was almost colorless and described what her husband, who worked for Kane, had done to her over the course of 4 years, and what Kane had done when she had tried to report it, which was to ensure that the report went nowhere. The room was very quiet during Constance's testimony. Ferris's cross-examination of Constance was not aggressive. Clara watched him recalibrate in real time, watched him understand that attacking Constance directly would cost him more than it gained him, and she credited him with cold professional respect for being smart enough to recognize it. Court broke for midday, and Clara sat in the room while most people went out, because she did not want to walk through the crowd, and she did not want to speak to anyone who might be watching for a reaction. Hollis sat beside her and ate half a sandwich and reviewed notes. He did not offer her reassurance. She didn't want any. "Ferris is going to come after your credibility this afternoon," he said. "He's going to talk about your character, your judgment, and your motivation. He's going to suggest that you pursued this case because you were embarrassed and vindictive and wanted to harm Kane's business interests." "I know," she said. "When he says things that aren't true, your face needs to stay neutral." "I know." "When he says things that are partially true, I know, Emmett," she said. He looked at her. He almost smiled. "All right," he said, and went back to his notes. So, she took the stand in the early afternoon. Hollis walked her through the testimony they had prepared. The letters, the courtship, the marriage, the 3 days in Abilene, the arrival in Red Hollow, the moment in the street. She told it plainly, the way she had told it in his office above the hardware store, the way she had practiced it in her small room at the ranch at 4 a.m. when the cold pressed against the window. She told it without the feelings, because the feelings were hers and they belonged to her, and she was not going to put them in front of this room. She was aware of the room while she spoke, not distracted by it. She kept her eyes on Hollis when he was asking, on the judge when it was appropriate, on the middle distance when she was simply recounting. But she was aware of the quality of attention, the way a room full of people listening has a sound that is different from silence. She was aware of Caleb in the third row on the right side, Walt beside him, Toby on the end. She did not look at them. She was aware of them. She was also aware of Victor Kane at the defendant's table. He had the stillness of a man who was managing himself carefully, which she knew cost him something because Victor's preferred mode was not stillness, but control, and stillness was what control looked like when it was constrained. Hollis finished his examination and sat down. Dade Ferris stood. He was good. She had known he was good, and she found it useful in a cold way to see it demonstrated. He started from the edges. Small questions about her history, her circumstances, the advertisement she had placed in the Frontier Gazette. He was building something. She could see it, laying groundwork at the perimeter before he moved toward the center. "Mrs. Kane," he said, "isn't it true that you placed a public advertisement seeking a husband because you had no other viable options available to you?" "I placed an advertisement because I was looking for a husband," she said, "as many women do. And you had no family support, no income, no property." "I had skills and a willingness to work," she said, "which I have demonstrated since arriving in this town." Something moved in the room. Not quite sound, but a shift in attention. Ferris moved to the marriage. He questioned her account of the 3 days in Abilene, not directly calling her a liar, but introducing the possibility of misinterpretation, of a woman in an unfamiliar situation perhaps perceiving things through the particular distortion of her own fear and inexperience. "Isn't it possible," he said, "that what you experienced as hostility was simply a man with high expectations and an exacting manner?" "It's possible to describe it that way," Clara said. "And isn't it also possible that the incident on your arrival in Red Hollow, the incident in the street, was the result of a misunderstanding, a momentary loss of temper, rather than a pattern of deliberate harm?" "Men who throw their wives into the street in public on their third day of marriage have already practiced the behavior somewhere less visible," Clara said. Ferris paused. It was a very brief pause. "That's a significant assumption, Mrs. Kane. It's an observation," she said, "based on what I know about how people behave." He moved to her motivations. He spent considerable time on her relationship with Caleb Mercer. The living arrangement, the working arrangement, the proximity. He was careful about it, staying within what could be implied rather than what could be directly stated, but the implication was clear enough. "You moved to Mr. Mercer's ranch within weeks of arriving in this town," Ferris said. "Is that correct?" "I moved to Mr. Mercer's ranch because your client arranged for my housing to be unavailable," she said. "I believe that's documented." Another shift in the room. Ferris asked 3 more questions, and then he said something that she had not expected, which was the thing about her father. He had found out, she didn't know how, didn't know when, that her father had remarried and had not maintained regular contact with her. He used it to build an implication. A woman with no family ties, no stable history, no one who had found her worth keeping. She looked at him when he said it. She took a breath. "My father made choices that served his own interest," she said. "Victor Kane made choices that served his. I have spent the last 4 months working for every dollar I have and documenting every piece of evidence that belongs in this case, because I understand that what I do or don't do in this room is the only thing I control." She kept her eyes on Ferris. "My father's choices say something about my father. They don't say anything about me." The room was very quiet. Judge Pruitt looked at Ferris. Ferris looked at his notes. Then he said, "No further questions," and sat down. The afternoon continued with Hollis calling his remaining witnesses. Frances Cates came to the stand and testified about what she had seen in Red Hollow in the months since Clara's arrival. The threats, the social pressure, the deliberate manipulation of public opinion that she had observed Victor Kane conducting through intermediaries. She was calm and specific, and she held Ferris's cross-examination with the steadiness of a woman who had decided that being afraid of the wrong thing was what had cost her 9 years. Then Hollis called a witness Clara had not been told about. His name was Martin Hoyle. He was a man of about 60, with the look of someone who had not slept well in a long time. He had been, Hollis established in the first 5 minutes of his testimony, Victor Kane's business partner in a land acquisition scheme 3 years ago in a county 200 miles north. The scheme had involved the fraudulent transfer of property titles from homesteaders who did not fully understand the documents they were signing, facilitated by a notary who was later disbarred. Martin Hoyle had participated in it. Martin Hoyle had, at some point in the past 18 months, decided that the weight of what he knew was more than he wanted to keep carrying. Hollis asked him in plain and specific language to describe Victor Kane's methods. Martin Hoyle described them. He spoke for 40 minutes. He described fraud, intimidation, the deliberate targeting of people who lacked the resources or the standing to fight back. He described a man who operated through proxies and through fear, who had built a network of obligation and threat across several counties, who had done to others, to families, to workers, to anyone who became inconvenient, what he had done to Clara, scaled up and made more elaborate. The room was not quiet during this testimony. There were sounds, movement, voices, the particular noise of people whose understanding of something is being revised against their will. Victor Kane sat at the defendant's table and was very, very still. Ferris cross-examined Hoyle with everything he had, attacking his credibility, his motivation, the deal he had made with Hollis. There was a deal, Hoyle admitted it, involving his own cooperation in exchange for consideration in a separate matter, and Ferris pressed on it hard. Hoyle admitted the deal. He also said, "It doesn't make what I'm telling you less true." The jury was out for 2 hours. Clara sat in the corridor outside the courtroom with Hollis on one side and Caleb on the other. Dolores had come into town at some point in the early afternoon. Clara had not known she was coming and had not expected her, and when she had appeared in the corridor during the midday break with a tin of food, Clara had stood up and then sat back down because she hadn't known what else to do. "You should eat," Dolores had said, handing her the tin. "Everyone keeps saying that," Clara said. "Everyone keeps being right," Dolores said. Now, in the corridor, waiting, Dolores sat across from her on the wooden bench and knitted. The sound of the needles was steady and specific in the quiet, and Clara found it improbably steadying. Hollis reviewed papers. Caleb sat with his forearms on his knees and said nothing. He had been like this since the testimony, present and still, and not requiring anything from her, which was exactly what she needed and which she registered with a gratitude she didn't have the right words for. "Hollis," she said quietly. "Hoyle," she said. "You didn't tell me about him." "I know." "Why?" He looked up from his papers. "Because you would have asked me how I found him, and I would have had to tell you, and you would have spent the last 3 weeks worrying about whether he was credible." "Is he credible?" Hollis looked at her. "The jury is deliberating," he said. "I'll tell you after." She made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had been a different day. The jury came back at 4:30. She walked back into the courtroom and sat down and put her hands flat on the table and looked at the front of the room. She heard the room filling behind her, the sound of people returning, settling, the particular quality of collective held breath. Victor Kane sat at the defendant's table and did not look at her. He was looking at the jury as they filed in, and his face was the face she had seen in the wash shed on the Mercer Ranch. The calculating face, the one that was evaluating a problem, the one that treated the world as something to be managed. The jury foreman was a man named Peters who ran the grain mill outside of town. She had seen him twice before, once from a distance, once passing on the street, and had no particular sense of him. He stood with a piece of paper in his hand and the slightly formal quality of a man discharging a duty he takes seriously. "On the charge of assault," Peters said, "we find the defendant guilty." Clara's hands, flat on the table, stayed flat. "On the charge of property damage related to the arson incident of December 14th, she heard Ferris object, heard Pruitt sustain it, heard the charge reframed. The formulation that made it to the verdict was narrower than what she had wanted, but it was still a verdict. Guilty. On the charge of fraud in connection with the property transfer scheme documented in evidence." This was Hoyle's testimony. This was the charge that Ferris had spent the most time fighting, that Hollis had built the most carefully, that had seemed, in the weeks before trial, the most uncertain. "Guilty," Peters said. The room erupted. Not cleanly. It wasn't the sound of a verdict in a story, where things resolved neatly. It was the sound of a room full of people who had not all wanted the same thing, some of whom were relieved, and some of whom were angry, and some of whom were simply surprised. It was noise and movement, and the bang of Pruitt's gavel calling for order, which achieved partial order, and then more noise. Clara sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the front of the room. Victor Kane was on his feet. She could hear Ferris speaking to him in a rapid, low voice, the voice of a lawyer managing a client's first response to bad news. Victor's face had changed, not to anger, not yet, but to something she had not seen on it before, which was loss of control. The calculation was gone. There was something underneath it that she had never seen and that she looked at for a moment, with something that was not quite satisfaction and was not quite pity, but was somewhere in the complex territory between them. She turned away from him and looked at Hollis. Hollis was writing notes. He looked up after a moment, saw her looking, and said, 3 out of 4 charges. The 4th one will appeal. What does it mean for him, she said. What happens now? Sentencing in 6 weeks, Hollis said. The fraud charge alone carries significant prison time, depending on Pruitt's inclinations. The other charges compound it. He capped his pen. His properties are subject to review pending the fraud conviction. Dade Ferris is going to have a very difficult conversation with his client in the next 24 hours. She nodded. She was aware that the room was still moving around her, that people were standing and talking, and that the particular loud disorder of a just concluded trial was happening on all sides. She was aware of Caleb somewhere behind her, and Dolores and Walt and Toby and Francis Cates, who she could not see but knew was somewhere in that room. She stood up from the table. She stood up in the Red Hollow courtroom with the verdict behind her and the noise around her and the winter light coming through the high windows, and she felt not triumph, which was too simple, and not relief, which was too easy. She felt the weight of the last 4 months settling into her body all at once, the way something heavy settles when you finally set it down. She turned around and found Caleb 3 feet behind her. He looked at her. She looked at him. The room went on being noisy around them. It's not over, she said, because she needed to say something accurate. No, he said, but that part is. She nodded. Her hands were shaking now, which she let them do because there was no longer a particular reason not to. Caleb looked at them, then looked at her face, and then he did something she had not expected, which was to put one hand over both of hers, briefly, the way you put a hand over something that is shaking to steady it, and then he let go. Dolores appeared at her elbow with a coat. Put this on, she said. It's cold outside. Clara put the coat on. She turned back toward the door, and the corridor, and whatever came after the corridor, and she walked. The shaking in Clara's hands lasted 3 days. She didn't mention it to anyone. It wasn't the dramatic trembling of someone in crisis. It was something quieter and more persistent, a fine vibration in her fingers when she held a cup or a pen, as though her body had been running at a particular tension for so long that it didn't know immediately how to stop. She noticed it when she sat down to write to Hollis the evening after the verdict, and she noticed it the next morning when she poured coffee, and she noticed it the morning after that, and on the 4th day it was gone. She thought about that afterward, about how the body keeps its own account of things, separate from the one the mind keeps, and how it settles those accounts on its own schedule regardless of what you think you're ready for. The ranch was quieter in the days following the trial, not uncomfortably so. It was the quiet of a place that had been holding its breath and had finally exhaled. Dolores cooked more than usual, which was her particular form of processing things she didn't want to discuss. Walt fixed 3 things around the property that had needed fixing for months and that he had apparently been saving for a moment when fixing things felt right. Toby, who was 17 and had not entirely understood the legal proceedings, but had understood that something important had happened, was uncharacteristically subdued for about a week and then returned entirely to his normal self, which was a relief. Caleb did what Caleb always did, which was work. But the quality of his working was different in some way Clara couldn't name precisely, less like a man carrying something and more like a man who had set it down. She noticed it in small ways. He spent an extra half hour over supper instead of rising the moment he was finished. He sat by the stove in the evenings and read his book with something that looked, if you were watching carefully, like ease. She was watching carefully. She had been watching carefully for months, and by now she knew the difference between the various qualities of Caleb Mercer's stillness. Sentencing was 6 weeks after the verdict, in late March. Hollis wrote to tell her that Judge Pruitt had sentenced Victor Kane to 7 years in the Territorial Penitentiary on the fraud conviction, with additional concurrent sentences on the assault and arson charges, that brought the effective time to 9 years. Dade Ferris had filed an appeal, which Hollis expected to fail on the fraud charge, and which might succeed on narrower grounds on the arson, where the evidence was more circumstantial. She read the letter at the desk in the main room, and when she finished, she set it down and looked at the window for a while. 9 years. She turned the number over in her mind, trying to find the right way to hold it. It was not, she realized, satisfaction she felt. Or not only that, it was something more complicated and less comfortable. 9 years was a real consequence for a real thing. It was also in the larger accounting of what Victor Kane had done to how many people over how many years incomplete. She knew that. Hollis knew that. The women who had testified knew that. The men whose land deals had been manipulated, whose livelihoods had been taken by a man who understood how to use systems against the people those systems were supposed to protect. They knew it in the most immediate possible way. But incomplete was not the same as nothing. She had learned that in Red Hollow. Incomplete was what you worked with because perfect was not available and waiting for it was just another way of standing still. She wrote back to Hollis the same day. Thank you. What comes next? His response, which arrived 4 days later, was the longest letter he had sent her. It laid out the civil proceedings that were possible now that the criminal conviction was in place. The property claims, the restitution, the process by which some of what Kane had taken might be recoverable. It also contained a paragraph at the end that was unlike any of the other paragraphs in any of his previous letters, because it was not about the case. You asked what comes next, he wrote. In legal terms, I have given you that answer above. In other terms, what comes next is whatever you decide to make of it. I have been practicing law in this territory for 31 years, and I have had perhaps 4 clients in that time who understood, with the clarity you demonstrated, that the facts are the argument. Most people come to me wanting to tell me how they felt about what happened to them. You came to me with dates and names and documentation and a willingness to do the work. I don't say this to flatter you. I say it because I think you should know what you did here, and I don't mean just your own case. She read that paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter and put it in the case file, which she had moved from the small box it had started in to a larger one, and she sat with it for a while. It was Ida Marsh who first said it out loud. They were at a meeting in Dr. Webb's back room, the same room where everything had started more or less, with Frances Cates and her careful questions. There were 7 women now. Some of them were women Clara had helped find their way to Emmett Hollis. Some were women those women had brought, following some chain of trust that moved quietly through the territory in the way that important things often move. Not announced, passed from one person to another like something fragile being carried across difficult ground. They were talking about Frances. Her situation had not resolved with Victor Kane's conviction, because her situation was with Denton Cates, who was a separate problem and who had, since the trial, become more careful and more dangerous in the specific way that men like that became when they felt the air change around them. He's watching everything she does, Ida said. He knows something is moving, and he knows it's connected to this, and he's trying to find the edges of it. What does she need right now? Clara asked. She needs somewhere to go, Ida said. Somewhere safe with her children. That isn't her sister's house because Muriel is too close to him and he knows it. The room was quiet for a moment. Clara thought about the small room at the Mercer Ranch, about the stove that required a specific technique with the damper, about the way a room with a lock on the door felt different from every other room she had been in before it. She can come to the ranch, Clara said, temporarily, while we figure out something more permanent. Caleb Mercer's ranch, Ida said. Yes. Ida looked at her with the measuring eyes. You'd need to ask him. I know, Clara said. I will. She asked him that evening. She sat across the supper table from him after Dolores had gone to the cottage and the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse. And she told him about Frances and Denton Cates and what Ida had said about what Frances needed. Caleb listened. He pushed a piece of bread around the plate. How long? He said. I don't know, a few weeks, until Hollis can advise on the legal options. Children? 2, 8 and 11. He looked at the table. The room next to yours is empty, he said. It's smaller. I know. Tell her to come, he said. And then, after a pause, tell her the stove in that room needs the damper on the left pulled out first, not the right one. It'll smoke otherwise. Clara looked at him across the table. He was looking at his plate. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. Just tell her. Frances Cates arrived 3 days later, in the early morning, with her 2 children and a bag that was not large enough to hold everything a person would want when leaving a place, because she had not been able to pack in a way that Denton would notice. She stood in the yard of the Mercer Ranch in the cold March morning, with the children on either side of her and the bag in her hand, and the particular expression of someone who has done something they cannot undo and is trying to determine if they are glad. Clara met her in the yard. She didn't say anything about how long the road had been, or how hard the decision was, or what it meant that she was here. She just said, "Come inside, the coffee is on." Frances came inside. The children, a girl named Nora and a boy named James who had the serious face of a child who has learned to read rooms, looked around the ranch house with the cautious attention of people entering an unfamiliar space. Dolores appeared from the kitchen and looked at them and said to James, "Do you eat eggs?" James said yes, he did. "Good," Dolores said. "Come help me." He followed her into the kitchen, which Clara marked as one of the more effective things she had seen Dolores do, and Dolores had done many effective things. The spring came the way spring comes on the high plains, not gently, but in interruptions, warm days followed by cold nights, the ground deciding and then undeciding and then deciding again. The new barn was finished in early April, the pale wood darkening with weather, the smell of fresh lumber that Clara had come to associate with the specific period of beginning again that had occupied the last several months of her life. She had begun, in the weeks since the trial, to think about what she was doing in a different way, not what she was surviving. She had mostly stopped thinking in those terms, or rather, the survival frame had become too small for what she was actually doing. She was building something. She had been building something for months and had not had the vocabulary for it, or had been too close to it to see the shape. What had started as one woman's effort to find legal standing had become something she didn't have a clean name for. Not an organization, nothing so formal. A network, maybe, or something even less structured than that. A set of connections between women in the territory who knew that if something happened to them, there was someone to write to, someone who knew a lawyer's name and a doctor's office, and a ranch with a room available. It was the kind of thing that sounds small when you describe it, and is not small when you need it. Ida Marsh had started talking to women in her part of the territory. Frances, once she had settled enough to think about something beyond her own immediate situation, began doing the same thing, carefully and quietly, with the particular intelligence of a woman who had spent 9 years learning to navigate around a dangerous person and could apply those navigation skills to safer purposes. Dr. Webb had started keeping better records, not just medical records, but the kind of careful documentation that could become useful if someone needed to demonstrate a pattern later. Hollis wrote in April to say that 3 separate complaints had been filed in the territorial court using the framework he had built in Clara's case. 2 of them were women she recognized. One was someone she had never met. "You should know," he wrote, "that the territorial judge has taken notice of the pattern. There is discussion at the Capitol about codifying some of the evidentiary standards your case established, specifically around documentation of physical harm and the admissibility of pattern testimony. Nothing is certain. Politics are slow. But it is moving." She read that letter to Caleb in the evening. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Hollis doesn't give compliments easily." "No," she said. "That letter is a compliment." "I know," she said. He looked at the fire in the stove. "How do you feel about it?" She thought about the question seriously, the way she had learned to take his questions seriously because he asked things he wanted actual answers to. "Like, I've been climbing something for a long time and I can see further from here than I could from the bottom," she said. "But I'm still on the side of it. It's not done." "No," he said. "It's not done." He was quiet for a moment. The fire ticked. Outside, the spring night was making the sounds that spring nights make, the particular aliveness of a world that has been cold and is warming again. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the East Parcel." She looked at him. The East Parcel was a piece of land adjacent to the Mercer Ranch that had been in a complicated title situation since before Clara's arrival. Something to do with a previous owner who had died without clear documentation and a surveyor's report that was disputed. She knew about it because she had sorted through the ranch records and found the correspondence about it. "What about it?" she said. "Hollis thinks the title situation is resolvable," he said. Now that the county records office is under new management, he paused. The previous county clerk had emerged during the Kane proceedings in a business relationship with Dade Ferris that had involved a number of creative interpretations of property documentation. The new clerk had been appointed 2 months ago. If the title clears, the parcel would add about 40 acres to the east side, better water access, better grazing. "That's good for the ranch," she said. "It's good for us," he said, not correcting her exactly, just using a different word. She looked at him. He was looking at the stove, the fire, the careful man who said things directly when he had thought about them enough to be sure of them, and who had clearly been thinking about this one for a while. "Clara," he said, "I'm not good at this kind of conversation." "I know," she said. "Keep going anyway." He looked at her then. "You've been here 7 months. You've done work I didn't ask you to do, and you've done it well. You've brought people here and made decisions on behalf of this place, and I'm not complaining about any of that." He stopped. "I'm saying that what you've built here isn't a temporary arrangement anymore, and I'd like to make that official, if you're willing." She held his gaze. "What does official mean to you?" He looked slightly uncomfortable, which was the most she had ever seen him look anything that wasn't neutral. "It means the ranch is half yours. The east parcel, if it clears, is yours. The accounts you've been keeping are yours to keep. And," another pause, shorter than the first, "I mean us. I mean the other thing. I'm not saying it well." "You're saying it fine," she said. "You should think about it," he said. "You don't have to—" "Caleb," she said. He stopped. "I've been thinking about it since January," she said. "Probably longer than that, if I'm honest, but January is when I admitted it to myself." Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, because Caleb Mercer did not change dramatically, but in the specific way of a man who has been holding a question for a long time and has finally been given the answer. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They sat by the stove for a while longer, the way they had on 100 other evenings, and the fire burned down, and outside the spring night went on being alive. And neither of them felt the need to say anything further about it, because the thing was said, and they were both people who understood that what mattered after a decision was what you did with it. Sam. The divorce was finalized in May. Hollis handled it with the same thoroughness he handled everything, and Victor Kane, from the Territorial Penitentiary, did not contest it. Clara thought about that, about the man who had told her she had nothing, who had stood in the wash shed and described her options with the casual authority of someone who had never been wrong about his own power, now receiving legal correspondence in a cell and making no response to it. She did not feel the particular pleasure that some people might have felt about that. She felt instead the particular flatness of a chapter ending. Not triumphant, not sad, just finished. She signed the documents that Hollis sent and returned them, and received the final confirmation on a Thursday morning in May, when the apple tree that grew at the corner of the main house was in full bloom, and Nora, Francis's daughter, was attempting to teach James how to identify birds by their calls, which James was participating in with more patience than he usually showed for Nora's educational projects. Clara stood at the window and read the confirmation, and then folded it and put it in the case file, which she had moved for the 3rd time into a larger box. The divorce was final. She was Clara Whitmore again. She had been Clara Whitmore the whole time, of course. The name had just been obscured for a while by someone else's claim on it. It felt good to have it back clearly. It felt like picking up something she had set down in a hurry and not been able to get back to for too long. Frances and her children stayed at the ranch through the spring and into early summer. In June, Hollis completed the legal process that transferred Frances's house, the family home that had been in her name before the marriage, into her sole ownership, a process that had required documentation and a judge who was not sympathetic to Denton Cates, which had been, 6 months ago, difficult to find, and which was now somewhat easier. Denton Cates had been the subject of 2 separate complaints in the territorial court, and was currently in a legal situation of his own that occupied his attention. Frances left on a Tuesday morning in late June with her children and her bag, which was larger now than it had been when she arrived, because Clara had added to it quietly and without making anything of it. They stood in the yard. The new barn was completely finished and had begun to look like it belonged there. The East parcel had cleared. Hollis had sent the papers in May, and Clara's name was on the deed, which she had read 3 times before she believed it. "I don't know how to," Frances started. "Don't," Clara said. "You came forward. You testified. You sat in that room and told the truth. That's what you did for me." Frances looked at her. Her eyes were wet, which she did not appear entirely comfortable with, and which Clara understood because she had felt that specific discomfort many times herself. "Ida says there are 2 more women in her district," Frances said. "She's going to write to you." "Tell her to write to Hollis directly," Clara said. "He's faster now that he has the framework." Frances nodded. She got into the wagon with her children and the larger bag, and she drove away down the road, and Clara stood in the yard and watched until the wagon was a small shape against the flat summer landscape, and then not a shape at all. There are things about survival that nobody explains to you in advance. Nobody explains that the danger and the enduring of it is in some ways easier than the aftermath, because the danger has a clarity to it. You know what you are doing and why, and every decision has an immediate purpose. The aftermath is less clear. The aftermath is where you have to figure out who you are when you are not defined by the thing you are surviving. Clara thought about this in the summer evenings, sitting on the porch of the ranch house in the long light, with the sound of the land doing what land does when people aren't making noise at it. She thought about the woman who had gotten off the stagecoach in Red Hollow with $11 and a bruise on her face, and the particular stripped-down quality of someone who has had most of what they thought they were taken from them. That woman had been afraid. That woman had also, with the $11 and the bad boots and the one good dress, walked 4 miles to ask about a laundry job. She thought that was the part worth understanding, not the fear, which was understandable and human and entirely reasonable given the circumstances, but the walking, the 4 miles, the fact that a person can be genuinely afraid and also still moving. She had learned that from the women who came after her, from Frances, who had been afraid for 9 years and had still gotten into a wagon at 3 in the morning to drive to a lawyer's office, and from Constance, who had testified in a flat, controlled voice while her hands shook, and from Ruth Alderman in Abilene, who would not come to Red Hollow but had signed her name to a document knowing that signing it might cost her something. She had learned it from Ida Marsh, who was not an easy woman and not a warm woman, and who had sat in the back room of a doctor's office and said there are others with the tone of someone who had been waiting for someone to ask. None of these women were extraordinary. That was what Clara had come to believe most firmly in the months of working alongside them and watching what they did. They were women who had been put in situations that required more of them than should have been required, and who had met that requirement because there was no one else to meet it, and who had done it imperfectly and at considerable cost, and without any guarantee that it was going to work. That was not extraordinary. That was ordinary people doing what ordinary people do when the alternative is worse. She was not a legend. She was a woman who had done the work in front of her. But she understood, sitting on the porch in the summer light, that the work in front of her had changed. It had started as her own survival, and it had widened, the way water widens when it finds a channel, into something that was not only about her anymore. Ida's district, Frances's network, Hollis's expanding caseload. The discussion at the territorial capital that Hollis mentioned in every other letter, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that institutions move when they move at all, toward something better than what had been there before. She had not planned any of that. She had not set out to build a movement or change a territory or become anything. She had set out to not be broken by a man who thought that was his right. Everything else had followed from that first, stubborn, 4-mile in bad boots decision to keep going. Caleb came out onto the porch one evening in July and sat down beside her in the other chair that had appeared there sometime in the spring. She wasn't entirely sure when, only that one day there had been 1 chair and the next day there had been 2, which was how things tended to happen at the Mercer Ranch. They sat for a while in the evening quiet. "Hollis wrote again," she said. "Good news or bad?" "Mixed. The appeal on the arson charge succeeded, which means that specific conviction is overturned. But the fraud sentence stands, and the territorial court has issued a broader injunction against Kane's remaining business interests." She looked at the horizon. "Hollis says the net effect is the same." "But it doesn't feel the same," Caleb said. "No," she said. "It doesn't feel the same." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that going to make you stop?" "No. I know, he said. I just wanted to hear you say it. She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon, the specific way he looked at distances, with the attention of a man who has spent his life reading landscapes and understands that what looks simple from a distance is always more complicated close up and is more interesting for it. I've been thinking about the legal framework, she said. Hollis says the evidentiary standards from the case are being discussed, but discussion isn't law. There should be someone in the Capitol making the case directly, not just filing individual cases, but arguing for the structural change. Are you thinking about going to the Capitol? I'm thinking about whether it's possible, she said. What it would require. Whether Hollis has the connections. He does, Caleb said. He won't tell you he does, but he's been practicing law here for 30 years, and he has opinions about the territorial legislature that he shares with more people than he admits. How do you know that? I've known Emmett Hollis for 15 years, Caleb said. He taught my father how to read a title deed. A pause. Ask him directly. Tell him what you want. He responds better to that than to anything indirect. She nodded. She had learned that too, actually, the way Hollis responded to directness, the way most useful people responded to it, the way it cut through the peripheral noise and got to the actual thing. It'll take time, she said, longer than the case took. Most things worth doing take longer than you expect, he said. That's very wise, she said, and he looked at her sideways and she smiled, which was something that had come back slowly over the 7 months at the ranch. The way things come back slowly when they were genuinely taken from you, rather than just temporarily mislaid. He reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand over and they sat like that while the light went from gold to orange to the particular deep blue of a summer evening on the plains. The east parcel had good water, as Caleb had said it would. She went out there in the early morning sometimes, before the ranch woke up fully, and walked the boundary of it. The 40 acres that had her name on the deed, that were hers in the plain and legally documented sense of the word, not borrowed or rented or occupied at someone else's discretion. The grass was good. There was a stand of cottonwood near the water, old trees with the specific dignity of things that have been where they are for a very long time. She stood in the east parcel on a morning in August and looked at the cottonwoods and at the flat horizon beyond them and at the sky, which on the high plains in August is the particular shade of blue that seems too large for what's underneath it. She thought about what Emmett Hollis had written. What comes next is whatever you decide to make of it. She had been making something. She was still making it. It was not finished, and it was not perfect, and several pieces of it were still uncertain, and some of it had cost more than she had expected to pay, which was true of most things worth doing. But she had her name on a deed. She had 40 acres of good grass and old cottonwood and the sound of water. She had a room in a house that was also partly her house now, and a man who said what he meant and asked things he wanted actual answers to, and a woman in a cottage who had decided 15 years ago to stay and had been right about it, and a boy who tracked mud on the clean floor, and a retired ranch hand who had opinions about barn construction. And somewhere in Ida Marsh's district there were women who had her address and Hollis's name, and a slightly better chance than they would have had without either. She had built this. Not from nothing. She had never believed the story that people built things from nothing, because that story erased every person who had handed you something along the way, and she remembered every one of them. Caleb at the notice board, Hollis's unlit pipe, Webb's quiet discretion, Walt and Toby in their clean shirts, Francis at the table saying, "I'm not asking for a friend," Dolores with coffee and the instruction to eat. You built things from what people gave you and from your own willingness to pick it up and carry it forward, and the two parts were not separable. She turned and walked back toward the ranch, through the good grass, in boots that fit properly now because she had bought new ones in the spring with money she had earned herself, and the morning light came across the plains the way it always did out here, flat and honest and not particularly interested in making things look better than they were, just illuminating them as they were, which was, she had come to believe, the most useful kind of light. The ranch was waking up. She could see the smoke from the kitchen chimney, could hear the particular sounds of a working place starting its day. Dolores would have coffee on. Caleb would be in the barn doing the first round of checks with the unhurried attention that was simply who he was. She walked back to it, back to the imperfect, ongoing, still being built life that she had not planned and could not have predicted and had made anyway. Out of hard work and stubbornness, and the occasional willingness to ask for help, and the repeated decision across 7 months of mornings that were sometimes terrifying and sometimes ordinary, and occasionally, unexpectedly, just good, to keep going. She walked back to it and went inside and began the day.